I'd love to introduce Mark Simmons. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Spencer. Wow. Okay, that's all. Hi, everybody. You know, I feel a little odd here at a shark conference talking about a killer whale, but that's okay. They're all top predators, right? So I want to leave some room here for some question and discussion after we're done, because there are a lot of topics and a lot of interest in Keiko's life and what was done with him. So I want to leave room for that. So bear with me. I'm going to go through this rather quickly. This is, and I'll tell you a little bit about why this is relevant to my life. Just a brief history. I started out in 1987 at SeaWorld in Orlando, and I often say that SeaWorld was the Harvard of the marine mammal field. They were, and they still are, very best at what they do in marine life zoology. That gave me the skill sets that I had to become the director of animal husbandry for the Keiko Release Project, which we're going to be talking about today. So if I turn the clicker on, we might actually be able to move forward here. So first thing about understanding Keiko, my background's in behavior, right? So behavior is a science, just like any other science. The principles of learning are empirically defined. And this has led me around the world in different capacities, consulting for governments, for marine mammal protective legislation. The last 17 years of my 28-year career has been rescue and research, proactive health assessments, which I'm involved with right this week as we speak on the east coast of Florida. But that also gave me the capacity to work on a project like Keiko, a reintroduction project, because this is all about behavior. So one of the things I want you to think about as I tell you this story is I want you to think about Keiko's learning history, right? In psychology, there's two types of learning history. There's phylogenetic and ontogenetic, and don't worry about that. I don't want anybody to get any nosebleeds. But the difference between the two is that one talks about the evolutionary history of a species, its physical capabilities. The other talks about the animal's individual learning history from birth, right? We all understand that. That's what defines us. What makes us individual and different from each other is what we learn in our experiences throughout life. So let's take a look at Keiko's. 1978, he's collected approximately at the age of 2, right? And I'll show you in just a minute, he was actually younger than that. In 1980, he's moved from Iceland, almost 3 years later, to Marineland, Ontario, where he's with 6 other killer whales. But he was socially ostracized even then, so he was a bit of an outcast. 1986, he's moved to Reino Aventura in Mexico City. And in this picture over here to the right, he's supposed to be about 9 years of age, but I can tell you from experience with male killer whales, that's a much younger animal than 9 years of age, which means he was probably collected at more like 1 year of age. So, 1993, the movie Free Willy comes out. All of you know about, probably seen Free Willy. And that started a big craze and a lot of pressure to actually release the real whale that the movie was based on. So in 1996, after Free Willy Keiko was formed, Keiko was physically moved to Oregon as the first phase of his release. And in 1998, starting the second phase of his release, he was moved to Iceland, a little island in the Westman Islands called Vestmannaeyjar. And that was to take him back to his home waters where he was collected. Now the idea here was that once they got him back to his home waters, all these memories are going to come back and instinct is going to kick in, and that he's going to remember how to survive on his own. They also believed that finding his family was important. But once they got him to Iceland, nothing really happened. So after 5 months in Iceland, he was just really sitting there floating and hung out next to his big blue plastic boomer ball, and they were confused. They weren't sure where to go from there. That's when myself and my business partners became involved, because our background was in behavioral sciences, and we wrote rehabilitation protocols to teach him how to be wild again. Now there are criteria that tell us whether a cetacean, a whale or a dolphin, can actually survive in the wild, and these were written by the Navy on a commissioned report for the U.S. Navy in 1993. They've become the standard. But what's important here is, and you can see some of those turn to red, 7 of those 9 criteria are heavily invested in the behavioral sciences. The theme here that I'm going to keep pushing through is that we have got to understand an individual animal's learning history before we can make good decisions about what's in the best interest of that animal. So, moving along here, I'll just give you a brief history of what went on when we stepped into the process. Now, think about, this is on a complexity level of putting a first man on the moon. This is an animal that spent 18 years of his life with his human foster family. And despite the fact that he was in a small pool in Mexico, certainly too small for an adult male killer whale, his history and interaction with humans was immensely positive. At every stage of his life, his interaction in history with humans was immensely positive. So how do we deprogram that? Well, a lot of it's logistics. First of all, we had him in a bay pen, a small pool, within a secluded bay in Iceland to let him get acclimated to the water. We had to get him physically fit. This is an animal that, Mother Nature is the toughest trainer out there. So if he had an off day throughout his entire life with man, that's okay. He was loved and he was coddled. Mother Nature doesn't care about second place. And his food would have its own ideas of survival. So we had to get predatory type responses in a sharp animal here that was opportunistic and responded to things in his environment. So that was really part of the first phase in his bay pen. Then we moved him physically to the bay, an enormous area, to continue that process and get him to start staying away from humans and to learn to be on his own and sort of become an extrovert, if you will. The next phase after that was to take him to the open ocean. But I'll tell you, before we go there, I'll just give you some images here you can see of the process in the bay. That was really cool. Iceland, if you ever get a chance, go to Iceland. Coolest place on the world. It looks like you're landing on the face of the moon. But you see these rock faces here, and this is a beautiful day, by the way, that I'm showing you. Most of the pictures you've seen here. This is the walk boat that we used. We trained him to follow a very, very distinctive walk boat to physically get him from the bay to the open ocean, and you'll see more of that in just a second here. But one of the biggest challenges up there was the weather. And in all the news and the media lately, you hear about these sanctuaries, and you hear about bay pens and the sea pens, and let's release the whales, and let's do this and let's do that. But besides the fact that we have to consider the animal's individual learning history and what's familiar to them, which would be akin to saying, hey, you grew up in New York City in a condo, you loved your life, you had a great life, and then I'm going to rip you out of that and put you in the countryside, and they'd say, there you go, you're happier now, right? So beyond that aspect is the logistics of how we can work in the marine environment. The ocean is a big pool of corrosive acid, and it's just trying to destroy every man-made thing that we put into it. The weather up here, I weigh 220 pounds, and we had winds in excess of 140 miles per hour with gusts up to 175 miles an hour. And they told me when I got there that it could pick you up and take you off the bait pen, and I just kind of thought, okay, they're exaggerating. But they weren't. And we dealt with this all the time. I was carrying 2 35-pound buckets out one time, and it picked me and the buckets up off the ground. So that's the kind of weather that, I'm showing you all the pretty pictures, but that's the kind of weather that we dealt with. And the bay pen that Keiko was in was very dangerous to him. Because it was constantly undulating and moving, and the nets were coming to the surface, and there was lots of opportunities for jagged edges and other things for him to get stuck in. So as we dealt with those challenges, the next phase was to move him out to the open ocean. Now initially, we could not introduce him to wild whales, and that was because the Icelandic government would not let us do that. But we had to take him out and start getting him used to that open ocean. The only way that we could do that was to teach him to follow this walk boat. So it was like teaching your dog to walk without a leash. But there's a problem with that. The walk boat became his new mama. So We didn't want that association to occur very long. It was just a matter of using it to introduce that open ocean. But I'm going to show you a little video here, and I'll talk over a little bit of it. But this is some footage that has never been seen before. And this is Keiko out with some experience and introduction to wild whales. And what I want to talk about while this is playing is his very first introduction to wild whales was immensely traumatic. Again, we go back to learning history. So here he is, he's getting more and more familiar with this mama boat, his walk boat, and his relationship with humans is still there. So it's pivotal, it's very, very critical at this stage how we introduce him to the wild whales, and that this is a slow process. Unfortunately, the organizations in charge were looking for that documentary. They wanted to prove to the world that the movie Free Willy could actually be done. So beyond all else, it was important to get that shot. And a lot of pressure was put on that first introduction. And it went very, very badly. In fact, it was immensely traumatic for Keiko. And this is akin to, imagine you've never flown before. And I get you on a small airplane and we go up and we crash. And miraculously you live. How soon am I going to get you on another airplane? You know, that's the kind of traumatic learning that Keiko was faced with when he first was introduced to the wild whales. He went out later on for the next couple of years, always with his human counterparts. I know that you've heard Keiko swam free in the ocean for 5 years. That is not true. Keiko was never without his human counterparts. He never failed to choose his human foster family, regardless of how many opportunities he was given with the wild whales or with the wide open ocean. So let's fast forward to what happened here at the end of this story. These were the ideas that the organization believed in. Basically magic, instinct, spontaneous recovery, that if he found his family, he would recognize them and they'd swim off into the sunset. But I want to give you an idea that from a learning standpoint, this is what reality looks like. And we're not going to dwell on this. I just want the juxtaposition of the principles of learning and things that take place in a situation like this, and trying to teach an animal to acquire skills that he's never known before. So in summer of 2002, they were 60 miles offshore with Keiko. And weather came in and they had to leave. They couldn't stay out there. So they left Keiko and they went in back to the base of operations. Well, they tried to track him. They tracked him as far as the Faroe Islands, north of the Faroe Islands. And then they lost track of him and only had a satellite tag, which is usually about 24 hours after the fact. So they were never able to get an eyewitness spot on where he was or what he was doing. So nothing's really known about that time, but he did end up after 22 days, the only 22 days that he was ever on his own. He ended up in Halsa, Norway, a small fishing village on the west coast of Norway. And immediately people got in the water with him. And Keiko loved it. He went back to his human family. He got fed, he swam from boat to boat with his mouth gaping open. He was absolutely in hog heaven, back to what was familiar to him. So the organization said, well, that's not going to work. We've got to show the world we can free this whale. So they took him away from all of that to a secluded lagoon, and they based their entire idea that he had eaten over 22 days because he hadn't lost weight. But a killer whale can go 8 to 10 weeks without a change in body condition. Again, these organizations had never had an animal like this in their responsibility. They really didn't know anything about those types of traits. So they continued to push the release. Well, in December 2003, Keiko died. And they said it was sudden. It wasn't sudden. And what I really try to tell everybody here, what's the most important, this story is more important now than it's ever been before. Because a lot of the hype that's going on out there that you've heard, and I want to go on here just to make a point in a minute, but Keiko, it's not that he died, we all know he died. It's how he died. It's the most famous case of animal abuse the world doesn't know about. This was a long period of suffering for this animal, a very tragic ending to a story, a very cautionary tale. But what's important about this is, again, when we look at an individual animal's learning history, and I want to point out SeaWorld's whales right now because they're in the press a lot. They're the exact same. You can't even imagine taking your own dog and putting them out in the Amazon forest, right? We get that. We know they're not going to survive. The whales that are in human care for long periods of time, that's what they're familiar with. They don't have the skills that are necessary for survival. And you can see throughout Keiko's entire life cycle, from Oregon, the first phase, to Iceland, to North Atlantic, in the middle of the open ocean, to Norway, what's the common denominator there? Humans. That was his choice. That was what was positive and familiar to him. Now, one of the questions I get, and I apologize, I'm going to wrap this up really quick. We're skipping over a lot of things. This project was released at all cost. It was publicity over purpose. And it was agenda-driven, a fantasy, a prejudice, a hatred towards our zoological experience. And that is a public asset, by the way. I'm a huge proponent of our top quality zoos and aquariums. Why? Because what we don't see is the damage we've done to our world, right? The last century of our industrial activity. Our oceans are a big air sponge. They soak up the worst of our offenses. And what we do today, what we call conservation, I think that's, putting our plastic bottles away, cleaning up beaches and doing things like that. That benefits our great-grandchildren, but nothing is stopping the freight train of damage that has been done over the last century. That is coming. And so the work we're doing right now is salvage. It's not conservation, it's salvage, it's preservation. I've just spent the last week in the Indian River Lagoon, Mosquito Lagoon, on a dolphin health and environmental risk assessment, and I'll be there all next week. And I've been a part of this project for 12 years, and this is the world I live in. This is what's happening out there in the environment, in our coastal runoff. So this is all human impact. And I'm going to bring this right back to Keiko and back to our top quality zoos and aquariums, because they are the biggest piece of artillery in the preservation of the world around us, the damage that we've done, the salvage work that we have to do. They are the showroom front and center in the fight for preservation and conservation. When I'm out there at 3 a.m. on a rescue or stranding with a fragile neonate, a little baby, it's zoological professionals that are always at my side. Why does this make sense? Because they have the willpower, they have the expertise, the equipment, the logistics, and they're not your father's Oldsmobile. I hear this all the time, that zoos are just profit-driven organizations, but it's true of our society. I've gotten the privilege of traveling around the world quite a bit. We live in a privileged society because we've had this exposure and we fell in love with these animals. We fell in love with the animals we went to see. We fell in love with the animals we were caring for. And it's changed our value framework. So these organizations are big, playing a huge role in the fight that we have to preserve the animals around us. So that's why I'm such a proponent for that. And our apex predators are the most at risk, which relates right back to Keiko and his story. And folks, I apologize. I normally have quite a bit more time, so I skipped over a bit. I want to, if you guys have any discussion or any questions that you have, I'd like to go ahead and allow you to do so. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, great question. She's asking me, obviously we signed on for the project, so we must have believed in it. That was very difficult, and all of that is detailed quite a bit in the book. It was very difficult. We negotiated quite a bit. We wanted to make sure that the best interest of the animal would always prevail. So we'd follow those criteria outlined by the Navy, and if he didn't meet those criteria, that he would be provided permanent care. Ultimately, that didn't happen. But that was we believed we could give him the best chance, but as long as he would always be cared for, that was what was important to us. Any other questions? Yeah. Do I feel like places like SeaWorld people go as positive? Absolutely. Absolutely I do. Because, not everybody can be out in the wild seeing what I'm seeing. I mean, those animals they have a pristine environment. They get the perfect food. They're very, very well cared for. And every day we're learning about them, and that translates to empowering us to enact preservation plans with animals in the wild. We know metabolic rates. We know gestation periods. We know the entire life cycle from birth and how they learn their social behavior. All of this comes from, and by the way, I don't believe that we can draw a line between our best zoos and wildlife management. In the modern world, they are one and the same. They are interdependent. I don't see one or the other. They need each other. We need to work with biologists in the wild, while they need to work with seeing animals in human care and studying that behavior. And one of the most dangerous words, I think, this is a $40 million project where an animal was basically cruelly abused and suffered ultimately in the end, all based on the framework created by one word: captivity. This is a punitive word. I mean, you don't say to your neighbor, hey, I've got a golden retriever in captivity. What kind of dog do you have in captivity? You know, because that creates immediately the idea of deprivation, isolation, punishment. I've never worked with an animal in a quality zoo that was there for any of those reasons. So if we're going to be objective about this, and I think we've got a lot of serious work to do. We've got a lot of serious work to do. And it's going to involve our zoos at the front of that. So I think they're good in so many ways I can't cover all. Okay, you're asking me a psychology question that we'll talk about after. Okay? Anybody else? Yes. No, to my knowledge, no. In the United States, she's asking if any of these animals are still collected. No, I don't think a killer whale has been collected in the United States in over 30 years. The U.S. Navy does still collect animals, but I think the most recent was in the 80s. And by the way, on that note, because it has been out there a lot, it is illegal to collect a marine mammal for entertainment. That doesn't exist. So you hear a lot of, really radical anti-zoo proponents saying, oh, you can't, well, that doesn't exist. In the United States, the laws support that, but only under research and education grants. So, another bit of disinformation out there. Any other, yes? Yeah, her question is, they're intelligent creatures, are they stimulated enough in the care of man? Listen, it is a very different life. It is not a lesser life. I have worked with these animals day in and day out. Many of my good friends and colleagues work with these animals, continue to work with them day in and day out. They are, let's start with some science here. In the last decade alone, and I'm speaking specifically about killer whales, all right? In the last decade alone, killer whales in the care of man in this country, in an organization that quite frankly is the best marine zoological organization on the face of the planet is what we're talking about. Their animals are outliving some of the most studied wild populations in longevity, lifespan, infant survivability, and average age at death. So there's some of the science. Why is that happening? Because they know more and more and more about what they need to create a thriving environment for those animals. Not just pristine water and not just pristine food, but everything from mental stimulation to physical stimulation. So yes, it is a different life, it's not a lesser life. Okay, well, I think, how are we doing on time? We're okay? All right, maybe one or two more questions then. And by the way, like I've said, I've left out an enormous amount of detail. Just thank you for bearing with me as I rifle through this. But, all of that detail, if you're interested, is 428 pages of book over there. So, and be happy to sign them for you as well. What's a better option? What would have been a better option? Well, you know, he could still be alive today, absolutely. Tillicum, which is famous for all the wrong reasons, you know, he and Keiko were the same age roughly, and collected both from the east coast of Iceland. And Tillicum continues to thrive to this day. Keiko could have stayed in the ocean. We proposed creating a base of operations off of Ireland and taking him up and down the European coast. Now, why would we do that? This stuff, you know how much it costs to feed a killer whale? 150 pounds of restaurant quality food a day plus medical care. It's immensely expensive. So, you know, being able to tour him up and down the eastern coast, the western coast of Europe was the plan that we wanted to do to be able to support operations to sustain his care. And I really do believe he would be alive today. What he ultimately died of was chronic negative stress, which is as lethal as a bullet over time, and also malnutrition. So his entire system was breaking down from dehydration, and he had a chronic respiratory infection, recurring infection, that eventually, you know, got too invested in his system. Well, folks, thank you very much. If you have other questions, I will be right over here at this table, and really appreciate you coming and listening today, and have a great time at the conference.